It is September 16th, 2025, and we are continuing to watch as tensions are building all around the Trump administration and their handling of the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. As you have Israel moving in, targeting Gaza City, you have a UN commission finding that there is, in fact, genocide and that it was incited by Israel's top leaders. As you have countless questions surrounding what the next phase of the war against Iran is going to look like and just how involved the US is going to get. Well, what should we know about all of that and more happening now? We got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Colonel Larry Wilkerson, a U.S. Army combat veteran, former Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of State, and a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network. Colonel Wilkerson, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on some of the latest news, and I want to start with this recent report that was released by a United Nations Commission of Independent Experts finding that Israel is, in fact, committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, in this report, they say it is clear that there is an intent to destroy the Palestinians in Gaza through acts that meet the criteria set forth in the Genocide Convention. They give a number of different examples, but do you view this report as significant given especially the timing of it as you have Israel going into Gaza City, continuing to commit more and more genocide?
Yes, if there were any proof positive, glaring in all our faces, it is what they're doing right now at this moment. But this is dilatory. This is late. I went through this with Colin Powell when he was Secretary of State, and George W. Bush was the president and very reluctant, under the guidance of his Vice President, Richard Cheney, to declare genocide in South Sudan. You may recall that situation was pretty bad back then. You had the Janjaweed and you had people dying all over the place. And we had to go into the convention and search it. I mean, letter for letter, word for word, sentence for sentence, to try and make sure we had a legal case to take to the president. And Powell was not all that persuasive with George W. Bush at this time. The contention between him and Cheney and Rumsfeld was fairly tense. And the president tended to side with them more often than Powell, fearing Powell as a potential candidate for the presidency in 2004. The president never lost that feeling. But we got it. We got it. And for far less, Rachel, far less than's happening right now. So this is late. This is extremely late for them to be conclusive about this. But I'm glad they finally have been. Now, does it mean anything? I just came from an exercise at Columbia University where we featured the UN as a part of the exercise, and the comments in the crowd as the UN was pontificating, and I use that term carefully, were essentially that won't mean a thing. I mean, that's where the UN has arrived. And the Security Council in particular has arrived there because of two things. The veto power of the Perm 5, which is used to stymie action, and the United States is as guilty of that as any country in the world, any of the Permanent 5, and the fecklessness of the Secretary General, which we made sure of, Rachel, because I was there when Helen Clark could have been the Secretary General, and this would be an entirely different situation if Helen Clark had been selected. But when we saw that she was on the short list, we politicked hard to keep her from being selected. So we have a Secretary General who is without much spine and who more or less does what the United States tells him to do, because we're the biggest donor, bill payer and such. But it's a terrible situation when international law's most supreme council, if you will, is so feckless. But I'm glad they have finally done what they have done.
Yeah, it's incredibly concerning exactly as you're laying it out there when I'm looking at what the US is doing, what the US is supporting. And we saw a version of this with the Biden administration, right? Where we get to the end of it and we look back and we go, wait a second, it didn't seem like the Biden administration really put any meaningful pressure on Israel to force a ceasefire or to agree to any kind of a deal. Then you get Trump in, he makes it sound like for a few weeks we get a version of a ceasefire, and now we're right back to this endless, well, it feels endless at this point, genocide with Trump as the champion, Trump as the one talking about, oh, we're going to clear all of the Palestinians off of their land in the Gaza Strip. We're not going to let them come back. And even just with this latest operation targeting Gaza City, you have the warnings that this is going to be deadly for the IDF, that this could be deadly for the remaining Israeli hostages. And yet Israel doesn't seem to care. The US doesn't seem to care. How do you view their goals here? And does it seem as though those goals truly are clearing as many Palestinians off of their land as they possibly can?
I think the end result that Netanyahu prefers is not a single solitary Palestinian left in Gaza, and for that matter, in the West Bank or East Jerusalem. And his goals go further than that. I think he wants and covets perhaps much of Lebanon, and he covets and wants much of Syria. God only knows, and that's a phrase I use guardedly, what he wants beyond that. But what we're looking at right now is, as you suggested, and the IDF chief this morning made remarks, sort of veiled, but nonetheless remarks in Haaretz, quoted in Haaretz, that were to this point, the IDF is about to fall apart. It has done so many heinous things. It has done so many things that are not in the kin of any of the soldiers, really, except the most draconian amongst them, that it has a post-traumatic stress rate that's off the charts. It has a suicide rate that's off the charts. It has a no-show rate that's off the charts, especially amongst reservists called back for another go. And it has casualties that it's never experienced before, not in this kind of warfare anyway. And it's taking on more. It's got several fronts going now, and there isn't an expert with whom I talk on Iran or on the Levant or on the Middle East in general, Southwest Asia in general, who doesn't think we're going to war with Iran before Christmas. And this will be Bibi's ultimate salvation because politically, militarily, strategically, he's defeated. And he keeps doubling down and reinforcing that defeat. One of the greatest faults in military history is reinforcing strategic defeat instead of walking away from it, counting your losses, and going in a different direction, diplomatic or whatever. He doesn't know how to do that. He only knows how to double down on the defeat. And that's what he's doing now. And going to war with Iran with the expectation that Trump will follow him in is disaster for him and for Israel, and maybe even for the United States, because, Rachel, we do not have the capacity to change that regime in Iran without 10 years of protracted war, $2 or $3 trillion of additional debt, and horrendous casualties. And even then, it will probably look more like Iraq looked at the end than a victory. So this is you might say, the unraveling of the empire, as well as the death knell for a Jewish state in the Levant.
Yeah, wow. That is a lot to take in there, right, as you're laying it out. But I am right there with you, right, as I'm watching this and going, okay, it seems as though Netanyahu has to have a war, right? He has to have another conquest that he's got to target. And when you look at the Trump administration and their handling of it and the way that they have played the role, and we saw a version of this even just recently when Israel carried out strikes in Qatar targeting Hamas leaders who were there to negotiate, but who were brought there by the US saying, hey, we've got a ceasefire proposal. They say, okay, we'll go over here to Doha, and all of a sudden Israel is carrying out strikes. And now you have reports that Bibi Netanyahu called Trump less than an hour before told him the plan. Trump didn't oppose it, and then Israel goes right along with it. It seems as though that is the way that the Trump administration is operating, even though exactly as you're describing it there, we don't see any case in which the US is going to quote unquote win a war against Iran. Do you see any chances of the Trump administration actually standing up here and saying or questioning whether or not this is in our best interest, especially as we are waging wars all around and we still have not ended a single one under Trump's watch, whether he would like to claim so or not?
That's a lot to unpack, but let me start with the tactical operational aspects. I think my sources are correct when they tell me that we actually flew a sort of adjusted combat air patrol over Doha to make sure no one interfered with Israel's strike. Did that with ash and trash airplanes, not with jets, not with things that would give it away, just early warning airplanes that were flying around Al Udeid and would have told Israel if anyone were impacting their ability to do it. So we were complicit, completely complicit with it. And the purpose of it, of course, was to stop the negotiations. That's what they wanted to do because Bibi did not want negotiations that led to a ceasefire, period. He doesn't want that. So that's why he attacked an ally of the United States. And the prime minister, I think it was, of Qatar, recently, 2 days ago, I think, called him everything from a narcissist to, I mean, you name it. He nailed Bibi Netanyahu. All to say that this is a man who's not going to be stopped. He is not going to be stopped, and not by Donald Trump. Donald Trump, and here's the kicker. The Kirk assassination, murder, whatever you wish to term it, was an indicator of just how fearful some people in the MAGA conglomeration should be, including the President of the United States. I don't say that loosely. There are ways that Netanyahu can get to anyone, and he has proven that over and over. Recently, we learned from a confidant that when he was having private talks with Boris Johnson, when Boris Johnson was prime minister, Netanyahu asked to use his private toilet. He went into his private toilet, came back out, and afterwards, British Secret Service found that he had put a bug in Johnson's toilet. This is Bibi Netanyahu. I have no problem whatsoever believing that. This is Bibi Netanyahu. I'm also told by people in the Secret Service that he's done that in the Oval Office, that he's done that in other places in the White House. This is Bibi Netanyahu. Whether those are all actual occurrences, and I think they are, and that's the opinion of an expert in this regard, whether they are or not, it is a clear depiction of this kind of guy and the lengths that he will go to make sure his enemies are thwarted. So all to say, I believe Donald Trump is very fearful of happening to him what happened to Kirk. And so we have got a president who is making decisions to a certain extent with regard to Southwest Asia based on his fear of what will happen to him if he makes the wrong decision. And that is George Washington's warning about foreign entanglements coming to a fruition that I bet you none of our founders ever dreamed of.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And that's so interesting because as you're describing it there, that was the one thing that stood out to me in the recent weeks, the final weeks of Charlie Kirk's life, right? Because if you look back at the last 2 years, a lot of his coverage was very favorable of Israel, right? It was critical of the Palestinian people. It was blaming Hamas for the predicament that the Palestinians in Gaza were in, blaming them for their own genocide. But then in recent weeks, it seemed like he started to change, right? And you saw some of his commentary, I know, in a recent interview he had with Megyn Kelly, where he was saying, hey, I'm worried about, Israel or I'm worried about it making it look like I'm turning on Israel or some version of that. I don't have the words exactly right. But him making those comments in the final weeks of his life, right before this very public assassination, murder. I'm with you. The terms kind of go back and forth on that one. But I mean, it does seem like that is a message of sorts to many in the Republican Party who have carried water for this genocide up until this point, right? Who have been so pro-Israel because that's what they have always been told to do. And even as that gets more and more dangerous for the US, what are your concerns, especially when it comes to someone like Trump, who went through a version of an almost assassination last year? So he's already in that place of being very wary about being personally targeted.
I do think there's credibility there, that he has fear of it, and I wouldn't blame him for having fear of it. And I think he knows where that fear is generated, the principal reason that fear is there. So that's going to make him not the best decision maker in the world with regard to that individual and that individual's circumstances. And I don't think he was the best decision maker in the world in the first place. So it's kind of easy for him to cross that road and say, not only do I not want to get assassinated, I've got this group out there led by Miriam Adelson, for example, that I need to satisfy, or I won't have the money in the coffers that I had the first time around. So that's a recipe for bad decision making, particularly with regard to Southwest Asia, which is why I think he will follow Bibi into Iran. He may protest. He may tell him that, no, you shouldn't do that. But, I think he'll follow him into Iran. And then all bets are off as to who fares worse in that, because I think the two states, Israel will be ended forever as a Jewish state, and the United States will be in 10 years of misery and incredible blood and treasure expenditure, and no real result at the end that looks any different, perhaps, than from the beginning. And we will probably force them to go deep underground and build a nuclear weapon. That's going to be an outcome of it too. I'm told by physicists who know, and I'm not a physicist, but I did have a lot to do with the AQCon network and the unraveling of it in the early 2000s. And so I know the talks that went on between the DPRK, North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and several other countries who were in that. I have to be careful here, but I signed a non-disclosure agreement. But if you look at that and you understand what the North Koreans probably conveyed to the Iranians about deep underground nuclear testing and deep underground building in general, we didn't detect the first North Korean nuclear test because it was so deep underground. The only way we detected the second one was because the seismic center in Geneva alerted us to what had happened with the seismic activity somewhere in North Korea. And we went, ooh, wow, we missed something. And so we put all the apparatus in place for the second one. And because it was in place and functioning at the moment it occurred, we detected that one. But Iran could do that, all to say that they could do that and come up with a nuclear weapon. And we could be into nuclear territory with this conflict. Very swiftly, we could be into it. And there's no question in my mind, Rachel, that this homicidal maniac, Bibi Netanyahu, would use a nuclear weapon if he felt that his fate, not Israel's, but his fate was existential. He would use a nuclear weapon. I would hope the IDF would step in and stop him. But given what they're doing at his beck and call with regard to this genocide and what's happening right now in Gaza, which in Haaretz this morning, the photos were just horrible. They were horrible what they're doing right now. I would think the IDF would have at least someone who would step in and say, you're not going to do this. You're not going to do this.
Yeah, I would hope so. But yeah, as you're watching this unfold and you're watching the lengths that Israel has gone to in this genocide in just the last, almost 2 years now. And then you look over at the position that the US is in. And I know that, for so many Americans, they get on social media, they see the horrific images and videos coming out of Gaza, and then they put down their phone and they go on with their daily lives, right? They feel like it doesn't affect them directly. And that has been the case for a number of the different conflicts that the US has started or been directly involved in. And is currently now. I mean, if we look at the proxy war against Russia, if we look at everything that the US is doing in the Middle East. And so I just wonder too, at what point do the American people start to wake up and realize that this is coming back home, that US foreign policy is having a direct impact on the American people? Do you think that that is going to happen, whether it's economically first, or is it the US getting directly involved, getting boots on the ground in another war, say a possible war against Iran, that forces the American people to finally wake up and realize, how did we get to this point? Because we got to have so many years of, time where we were kind of suspended in the middle and we thought we had everything figured out while our foreign policy was doing all of the dirty work overseas.
Well, those are all good questions and good comments. Um, you know, I think it's falling apart right now. I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene and maybe perhaps Kirk and others are the only ones questioning what's happening. And that's a very important thing to be happening, not necessarily because they're abandoning MAGA or disturbing the Trump entourage, but because they are realizing the truth. And they're realizing the truth through this vehicle, Israel. For example, there is very clear evidence coming out now, and I suspect that Kirk might have been privy to this, that October the 7th was staged by Bibi Netanyahu. That is to say, everything was set for October the 7th to deliver to him what 9/11 delivered to the United States. Carte blanche to go out and do whatever you need to do against your enemies. That he even orchestrated some of the money that went through Qatari sources to go to Hamas so they could be prepared to do what they did on October the 7th. And he even stood down all the alertness, if you will, of that border so they could do it. So this is all going to come out. It's coming out even as I speak. And I think that's going to be a death knell for the U.S.-Israeli relationship in the way it's been in the past, when the American people are made aware of all of this that Netanyahu has done and been enabled largely to do it because of our money and our support. I mean, I'm not saying we knew that he was staging October the 7th, so to speak, but we were providing the support. And a lot of, I tell people all the time, when he sends that money off to bribe that congressman, it's your money because you're giving him close to $4 billion every year. And God knows how much else if you total it all up over the time. So I think it's unraveling. I really do. My operative question is, will it unravel fast enough to save us? And to, in some respects, save the Palestinians? I don't know. That's a huge question for me, but it is unraveling. And I don't think if Bibi terminates everything right now, this minute, it's going to stop unraveling. I think it started and it's inexorable.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because as you're describing it there, I'm remembering in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, you had Netanyahu in this position where Israeli officials were using that phrasing, right? They were saying, this is our 9/11. They were not hiding it. And they have used it as their reason to carry out this direct genocide, to really increase it against the Palestinians. And it's been interesting to watch because I know that for someone like Netanyahu, Hamas has been used as a tool, right? He needed some sort of a force in Gaza to continue to target, which is exactly why we have not seen the quote unquote destruction of Hamas in the last 2 years, because this was never about Hamas. Well, the US also has its own versions, right? It loves to work with various extremist groups or to claim that they're targeting extremist groups around the world. And I know that so much of that is in order to, I don't know if the right word is to justify it to the American audience, but to right, convince the American audience that we are the good guys, that we're just pursuing freedom and democracy as always. When it comes to how long US foreign policy can continue into that realm, and I know you're talking about how it's already starting to fall apart, how do you see it? And do you think it's going to ultimately come back to the American people waking up? Or is this more so about other countries around the world rising up and presenting a real challenge to the US?
In that regard, they already have and already are, and will get even more powerful in this respect. We've got probably close to 2/3 of the world right now that is in some way viscerally opposed to what the empire is doing. And we fail to take note of this at our peril, Rachel. I mean, we really do, because the world is shaping. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization's recent summit was just one indicator. But we now have 2/3 of the world that hates our guts are very closely there too. That's not a good position to be in. And look at what Trump is doing elsewhere on this vista. He's assassinating people at sea. He just did his second boat, apparently. This is totally unconstitutional. It's against all forms of international law. It's even against what I would call international humanitarian law. And it's certainly against the Constitution, because he has no congressional permission to be killing people with military might on the high seas. He simply doesn't. Is this distraction he's trying to create? If it's distraction, he isn't doing a very good job, because this is murderous. not to make a pun, but it is murderous what we're doing on the high seas, and I don't feel like it's going to stop, because I think he thinks it's a diversion from the more potent crisis over in the Middle East, and to a certain extent in Central Europe too, where Ukraine is not solved. If Ukraine is solved in any way, it's that the Russians have thoroughly won, and we wait to see what that means in its consequences. The polls are not looking like they're too happy about it. Other members, new members of NATO, are not looking like they're too happy about it. We're in some pretty rough waters right now, and we're not led very well. And that's a circumstance, a coincidence that's really deadly for us right now, because our power is waning sharply and swiftly, and the rest of the world's power, particularly the East, with China as the magnet, is growing by leaps and bounds. So we are committing national suicide.
Yeah, I don't think it gets any more blunt than that, but I mean, I think you're spot on as we're watching all of these other countries come together and look over, and they are all asking the question of how do we deal with the problem that is the US empire. And it'll be interesting to see what they continue to do, as they're obviously already moving, and there is certainly a lot at stake here for the US and for the world all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Colonel Larry Wilkerson, a U.S. Army combat veteran, former Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of State, and a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you for having me on, Rachel. Appreciate it.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/RachelBlevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.